Hi everyone, and welcome to video 3 where we're going to talk about alterations for the easy knit dress pattern. And the first thing, I want to cover 4 things in this intro before we actually get to what I'm doing on the cutting table. And number 1 is I'm going to show you how to grade. If you printed out your pattern in 2, 3, or even 4 different sizes, you may be using a different side in a critical area of the bust, different side in the waist, and a different size in the hips. So I'm going to show you how to grade between the sizes. Number 2, the pattern itself uses 1/4" seam allowances. Yuck! I hate 1/4" seam allowances. Why? Because sometimes we're working with a really finicky knit and that knit likes to curl under the presser foot. That is never any fun. Another thing about 1/4" seams is if you ever have to let out a garment, those 1/4" seams do not give you the room to do it. And it's probably not going to matter as much if you're working with an ITY or a double brush poly, but if you're working with another fabric that doesn't have enough stretch, it will matter. So I like to add 1 inch just in case seam allowances, because that's really going to give you a lot of fit insurance if you have to let out. You can always take in, but you can't always let out with 1/4" seam allowances. All right, the next thing I want to talk about are princess seams. And the first time I made this pattern, I just made it as is, just 2 pieces front and back, didn't have princess seams. And I really got a great fit because you can do a lot with your side seams. But if you are really well outside the average size, for example, I'm like a double D cup, and I do have an upper broad back, so my back is broader than normal. When I get ready to wear, I can always feel the tightness in my back. It's too tight across the front. I don't have much of a bum, so I really don't have problems getting pants. But, hey, I'm at that age where, we tend to get some extra weight in our belly. So maybe there might be some garments where you just want to add a little bit more space width-wise to go around that curve in the belly so it doesn't look so pronounced. And you can do that with princess seams. So I'm going to show you how to add them in only if you want. If you want to go the easy route, just make a front and a back. If you want to customize the fit, try doing princess seams. You can have them on the back only, you can have them on the front only, or you can have them both on the front and back, but they go a long way to giving you a perfect fit. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about is balance lines. So what are balance lines? When you work with a pattern, you have a grain line, and the grain line on this pattern is going to be this center front or center back seam. Now remember, I have mine cut in 2 because I'm showing you how to do princess seams. But even if you don't have princess seams, what you're going to want to do is this is going to be parallel to your grain line when we set it on the fabric, and I'm going to show you how to do that. But I want you to draw another line about 3 inches away. Now if you're not doing princess seams, you're going to do that 3 inches all the way down from that center front or center back. That's going to be an extra vertical balance line. And then I'm going to have you do, it's easier to show in this pattern, horizontal balance lines. So we're going to have one at the mid armhole, we're going to have one at the bust, at the waist, and at the hip. And this is going to be really good to make sure that your pattern is hanging straight on your body, because those balance lines should be running at either vertical this way and not skewed one way or the other, or perfectly horizontal and not being tilted on one side. You actually can figure out a lot of body asymmetry by looking at these lines, and I always use them as a big fitting tool when I was really learning about fitting. And you probably won't need it for this pattern, but I want you to always do this, because in the future when you're assessing fit, it's great to have these balance lines to kind of help identify where a problem is occurring. All right, so I don't want to get too much into this because fitting can get kind of intense. So right now we're going to go right to my cutting table, and I'm going to get started on showing you how to cut out the pattern and do all those lovely things that I just talked about. At this point, you should have your pattern printed out, and I said in video 2 that you really need to print out page number 2 first, because on the Hala Patterns Agnes dress, your scale marker is on page 2. Most patterns, well, all the ones that I have used that have been downloadable, have some type of scale from which you have to measure, and this has a 1-inch scale. So I set my hem gauge at 1 inch, and I just compare it against the scale. and it is exactly 1 inch, so I am good to go. That means if I print page 2 and that scale marking is correct, I can go ahead and print the whole pattern, printing at 100% or actual size. So once this is done, I can start assembling the pattern. So let me just move these over right here. And what's really nice is when you look at page 1 of the Hala patterns, this is something that a lot of people can not look at and see it, but they don't see it, if you know what I mean. It's kind of like when you're driving and someone asks you, oh, do you know where this road is? And you know you passed it 1,000 times, but you can't exactly place where that road is. So the neckband and the armbands, if you are doing sleeveless, you're going to want to look at the armbands to cut them out. Now for this class, you have your choice. I do recommend doing sleeves, short sleeves, 3/4 or long sleeves, so that you have experience putting a sleeve into a garment. But if you don't, doing the armband is going to be just like doing the neckband. And here it tells you, based upon your size, what you should cut out. Now, I am a 10-12 on top due to that full bust measurement, so I will cut a 24.5-inch neckband. So make sure you circle what you have to cut for the band itself, because it's not going to be part of this printed pattern. This is going to be a separate rectangle to cut out. So how do you assemble this? On this particular one, they show you in the diagram for the dress what page you are looking at. So this is the very first page, because it's highlighted in gray on this dress, that you're going to have to connect to something, and that something is page 2. So if you look on page 2, that's going to show you right here, this second sheet is highlighted in gray. So let me just move these out of the way. This page will connect to this page. Now how I do it is I usually take one of those pages and fold it on the dotted line. All right, and you want to try to be very, very accurate when you do this. So let me just make sure this is good. Okay, and then once I have this folded, it's very easy to connect one dotted line to the next one. And I'm really trying to also aim to putting those plus lines together. Now you want to make sure that your lines are connecting perfectly. Now if I connected to the edge of the page, it would be like if I try to match the bottom of these pages up, my little plus line is going to be a little bit off. So always match where you think it's going to be best, and mine is going to be right here. So I am going to take some tape and I am going to tape that page together. So, all right, there we go. And notice how the seam line here, the cut line, excuse me, connects from page 1 to page 2. Then you're going to do the same thing at the top. You're going to connect those together and take some tape. It's very helpful to have a tape dispenser. It just makes it a lot easier to put your pages together. All right, so I'm going to work on taping all along this part right here, and then because there are no more pages to do in this first row, then I'm going to go to row 2 and put these two together. So I'll join you after I have row 1 and row 2 done. Let's take a look at what I got. Now, I told you before I was going to do the 2 rows, the first 2 rows. I actually did 3 because I think it's going to be easier to show you some special things about this pattern. So you can see going up, there is my first row right here. I did my second row following the guidelines that I see on this image right here. And then I did my 3rd row. So let's check this out for assembly. Let me just re-angle this a little bit. And to do this, I'm going to pull down the 1st and 2nd row. So right here, got this going. And what I did was I took the top row and I folded this under along the dotted line right here. So I like to do things row by row, just putting all of one row together, all of another row, put all my rows together, and then I like to assemble those rows. So this is row 1 and row 2. And I'm just going, again, I'm going to look for that crosshair right here. Put a piece of tape right there. And you always want to kind of look to make sure everything else is matching up. And let me look for my other crosshair right here. Whoops, get a little overzealous there. And then I have one more crosshair down here. So I'll just make sure that this one is aligned. And then I'll tape that. Now, sometimes I see online, sometimes people say, oh my gosh, my pages are really off, like things aren't connecting the right way. Or maybe they'll have a grain line marking down the pattern, and then they go to put it together, and the grain line on the second row may be different from the first row. This is where, you know, you always want to make sure that you are printing actual size or 100%. But sometimes when you're taping together, particularly really long rows going across, things can get a little off. So what I always try to do is look at the pattern and match the grain lines up and match these lines up. I do a visual. If you find that your lines are way off, then that's your clue to there is some type of big problem going on. And I would definitely go back and look at the printing, look at what you chose, because sometimes we think we have something chosen that isn't. All right, so let me just continue taping this. And you want to go all the way across. I don't like it when my pieces of paper have gaps, big gaps in the tape. I'll move this up, and I already pre-folded the bottom here so I can get my third row and then tape that together right here. So what I'm doing is just looking for this dotted line. I'm going to match these up, and then what I'm going to do is tape it. I'm going to continue with the remaining rows, and then I will show you when the pattern is all put together. Here's my full dress. Everything went together beautifully. I was so happy. All my lines just lined up perfectly over on the sides, over on the left-hand side, going down where the center fold is going to be. And if you look down here, if you ever want to make a maxi dress of this pattern, all you have to do is print out the remaining sheets down here, and that's really easy to figure out on your pattern which ones those are in the instruction file. So you don't have to reprint the whole pattern. And again, remember right here, let me move this pattern totally down so you can see that first page. Right here is where it'll tell you what pages to print out if you wanted the maxi dress. So this is just really a clear pattern, very easy to understand. And when I move this down, I didn't really notice this before when I first printed out this pattern when I made it last year, but it actually has the centimeters and measurements going across from the center front, which is really easy because, like, let's say you want to measure the waist and make sure that you have enough room in the waist. All right, so I'm going to do some grading here, but just to do a preliminary double check, you can just go across on your ruler and say, okay, all right, that's about 8.5 inches there. So 8.5 inches times 2 is going to be 17. So I would have 17 inches going across at that waist, and I could do it on the hip. It's just really nice that that ruler is printed there. Now right here on this page, it's going to show you some simple alterations, what to do to reduce height or add height. Your arm's eye right here. You know, sometimes if you buy a dress and it's too tight, it cuts into your underarm, and that kind of hurts. So it kind of tells you what to do, how to add or reduce the length of the hem, add extra height to your bodice, particularly if you know you're long-waisted. I'm short-waisted. This dress was fine for me, but I'm going to show you how to try to do a calculation of where the waist is, and also how to give a rough calculation of whether or not that waist will hit you, that greatest indent will hit you at the greatest indent on your body. But when we get into alterations, I will show that. You'll notice over here that I have two colored lines. I have the 6 to 8 red line, and I have the 10 to 12 blue line. I am two different sizes on different areas of my body, so I'm going to show you how to do some basic grading of a pattern to try to customize it to your size, because that's really going to be very helpful. On here, if I look at this diagram right here, it shows you what some of these lines mean. So for example, there is a front neck line and a back neck line. So if I make this come down a little bit more, and we look at that first page, you're going to see two cut lines right here. And you might be thinking, well, what is, why do we have two cut lines? Well, the back, the higher one is going to have the back cut line, and the lower one is going to have the front neckline. And I'll show you how to cut that out when we get to that point. So this is where you should be. And I'm now going to show you how to do some basic alterations. Let's talk about the size of your pattern. And when you printed it out the size or sizes that you need from the smallest to the largest sizes should have been printed on your pattern if you are multi-size. I am multi-size and I have two different cutting lines. So what I like to do as a frame of reference is to put the measurement that I'm going to cut for my bust as a 10 or 12. The waist is a 10 to 12 and the hip is a 6 to 8. Now I probably could get by with the waist of 6 to 8, but whenever you are working with the pattern for the first time, it's always, kind of nice if you think you might need a little bit more leeway to go with the larger size. So I am going to trace off the size. Now I know my hips are a 6 to 8. So below the hips, I'm going to do the 6 to 8. So I'll just kind of trace this off with a green marker on the overlay. Now when I get down to the bottom here, as far as the length, and I'm going to show you right here, there is just a negligible difference here on the hemline. So I really, I'm going to use my choice. I could use the 6 to 8, or I could use the 10 to 12. It just depends. If just like a smidge more length, you could do the 10 to 12 as well. So I'll just do the 6 to 8 because I am 5'6". I am the exact pattern size. I'm pretty sure this was designed for someone who's 5'6". All right. Now, if you were cutting the top, you would be cutting on this line. And since we are making the dress, well, most of us anyway, are going to make the dress, the knee length, we're going to be doing it right here. All right, so I'll pull this up. Now this is where I'm going to trace off the size that I am using for my neck and bust. All right, so I want to use the 10-12. All right, so I'm going to trace off this line right here. And I'm also going to trace off this line right here. Because when you trace it off, it's just a reminder as far as what sizes you should cut. And I'll put my line here and put my line here, bring it down. Now what I like to do, because I need to blend at my 6 to 8, I'm going to bring this all the way down at that 10-12 marking. And then I'm going to bring this down definitely to my waist. All right, so let me bring this up. And now I am at the waist right here. So this is where I traced up to the 6-8. Here is my 10-12. I could use a fancy dressmaker's tool called the French curve to do the connection right here, but I'm not, because I'm going to assume that if you're watching this, this is a beginner sewing class and you may not have those tools. So I'm going to get close here, and the general rule of thumb is to grade from smaller to larger. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to try to find my midpoint. And you guys, this is an art rather than exact science when you're freehanding it. And then just come right up here and just smooth it out when you're cutting it. Nothing big. And there we go. So I graded from the smaller going into the larger. Now, what about our sleeves? I am going to be printing out my sleeve pattern to show you what we're going to do with that. But first, we're going to handle the dress. Now, when you are making something for the first time, I always recommend side seam allowances of 1 inch. And with this pattern, it's telling you to use 1/4 inch seam allowances. You guys, if I've learned anything in life, it is not to use 1/4 inch seam allowances, and I'll tell you why. For the dress that I'm going to make from this pattern, I'm going to use an ITY, and I do recommend double brush poly. If you are sewing on a machine, some machines like to eat fabric, and also on some knits, the edges of the fabric will tend to curl. If you are using a 1/4 inch seam allowance on your sewing machine, I really feel that you're setting yourself up for a nightmare, especially if you're a beginner sewer. So what I do is on this green line, that's going to be my cut line, I want to extend it 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to measure out 3/4 of an inch from that green line that I have traced off. And I'm just going to go all the way up the side seams. These are just in case seam allowances. And just in case seam allowances really serve to save your rear end in tricky situations where something may not fit with the original seam allowance. So I just go right up here and I'm just kind of recreating this curve with a couple short marks. And again, all right, so then what I'll just do is freehand it here. If I had a curve, a fancy French curve, I would just connect these with the curve. But right here, I have my 1 inch just in case seam allowances. So 1 inch seam allowance. I always like to write that on my pattern so I know in the future what I have done. 1 inch essays. We're going to do this for both the front and the back. At the very top, what I also like to do is mark 1 inch seam allowances. So right here, again, I'm working with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I will measure out to that 3/4 and draw a new line. And this can be a little tricky here. I'm going to use my ruler here to bring it up. And then right here, I just want to make sure that if this area is a certain width, so I will measure at my 1 inch marking, and it's coming out from here to here is 1.5 inches. So I'm just going to move this up and measure 1.5 inches right here, and then just connect that line. And I'm going to do this again on, just try to, make it just about as smooth as possible there. So this will be a 1 inch seam allowance. And there is a reason why I do this too, because some people have very forward shoulders. Their shoulders are hunched forward. We live in a world where we are using cell phones more than ever. So sometimes we have to tinker with the placement of that shoulder seam, although we probably won't do any tinkering in class. I do like you to get used to doing that. All right, so that's where we're at. Now let's go into some basic alterations that you may want to do outside of blending. One of the great things about making your own dress is you can really customize it. And I know oftentimes I'm ready to wear dresses. In the back, I just have a lot of excess fabric because although my shoulder blades tend to stick out, I dip in the back. I call it that sexy back curve that I like to try to emphasize. But when I have too much fabric back here, it tends not to look good on me. So I have a couple options on how I can get this dress to better mold to my figure. If you're working with a really stretchy fabric, you can do a lot just by bringing in those side seams and molding it to where you want on your figure. But what I'm going to do is show you how to incorporate princess seams into a garment that doesn't have them, because that is just going to help you out in the future if you want to customize even further than doing the side seams. Or if you have taken my class before and you would like to customize it using princess seams, you can. But princess seams are going to be perfect if you are small in the back like me, or if you have a nice curvy bum, of which I don't have, or if you need a little extra in the front. Maybe you have like a tummy bulge and maybe you just kind of want to like de-emphasize that. Maybe just add a little bit more space in the front to kind of go over that bulge without emphasizing it. Because if you bring in your side seams only, sometimes that it just can cause that bump to look a little bit bigger, whereas having a princess seam will let you go in or out in small increments. All right, so I have a decision to make. I can have a princess seam coming from the armhole going down, or I could have it from the shoulder coming down. It doesn't really matter which one you choose. So I think to make things easy for myself, and I don't have to be fussy with the curve, I am going to choose a princess seam into the shoulder. So what I'm going to do is measure out exactly 3 inches following the fold marking, the fold line right here. So I'm just going to mark it 3.5 inches all the way down. All right, I'll move my pattern up, and then I will continue measuring out 3.5 inches from my blue dotted line and bring it all the way down. All right, so what's going to happen is this is going to be a cut line, okay? The next thing I want to do is, because this blue line serves as a grain line, it's going to be placed on the fold of your fabric. And grain lines are going to be really important to make sure that you are cutting the right way on the fabric. But I think what people forget to do is when they are trying to split 2 pattern pieces apart, they forget to do, and I've done this, they forget to create a grain line for that piece that doesn't have one. So using the center front or center back as my grain line, I'm going to bring this out here, and again, I'm going to bring it out here, and I'm just going to put a little arrow here. Even though there's not really a grain line there, you follow ribs on knit fabrics, but I'm going to put grain line marking and the dog marking right here. Dog stands for the degree of greatest stretch. So your stretch is always going to be going this way on the fabric when you lay down the pattern. Now when I extend that princess seam up to the top into the shoulder seam, so this is going to go right to the center of the shoulder seam and do about 5/8, because that'll be my center. All right, and I'll come down here. And then what I'm going to do is just make a curve. Now I can decide where I want this curve to be. This does not have to be straight, but this is just where I'm going to split apart my pattern if I want to. Okay. All right, so, and when I cut this apart, I will have to add a seam allowance to this, but don't worry about it now. So all I want to do is put some markings here of where I would want an additional princess seam. And I want everyone to do this because there is a reason why. Anytime you have a straight line, it's going to make sure that your pattern is hanging straight on the body. Likewise, there are other lines I want you to add. So with a ruler, and I am lining one of my marking lines up with the cut on fold line here, I want you to mark a horizontal line going across somewhere at that mid armhole. Then right around here near the bust line, again, I want a perfectly perpendicular line to that cut on fold. And then I want one at the waist. The more lines, in my opinion, the better. And you're really not going to see why this is important until you actually cut out and stitch up your dress. And I'll do it right here. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 horizontal lines, and we're going to use those horizontal lines to check to make sure that the pattern is hanging straight on our body. Let's review what we did in the first alterations video. We traced the size that we're going to use, and on the side seams and at the shoulder seams, I extended the seam allowance out 3/4 of an inch so that when we're stitching our seam lines, we are going to be using 1-inch seam allowances here as well as here at the top. Also, we added balance lines, and I added a balance line going across perpendicular to the cut on fold line at about the mid armhole and about 2 inches down from the bottom of the armhole at the waistline and approximately at the hip line. It's kind of hard to see because this was done on tape. I'll probably redraw it so it's below the tape so we can see it a little bit better. So what I'm going to do now is cut out my princess seams. And yesterday I told you that I'm creating princess seams on the back going into the upper shoulder. Also, if you are creating princess seams, before you ever cut this out, this right here is what you call your quote-unquote grain line. Now remember, in knits, we don't work with the grain line, we work with the rib. But you need to take this cut-on fold line and draw a grain line equidistant from your cut-on fold line. So your second piece that is cut apart from this one has a grain line marking on it, and it's easy to make sure that that pattern piece, that second pattern piece, is safe. So what I'm going to do is move this up, and I am going to start cutting with my rotary cutter on this line right here, and this is going to be my princess seam. So I'll cut it all the way up, move this down so you can see a little bit better. I'm just a little off here, so let me try to do this as best as I can, and then curve it right up here and into that shoulder seam. So now I have it cut apart. And you do want to try to make sure you cut on the seam. It's really not going to make that much of a difference, but accuracy really counts, and it's just doing it on video is a little tough. Now, I want to add a seam allowance here and here. When I cut seam allowances, I like to use extra paper here, so I'm not wasting any paper. So I'll take this right here and just cut off some of this excess paper. So I have some strips. And what I'll do then, whoops, this is falling off. I'm going to move this back over, and I'm going to create a seam allowance in here. I'll turn this over so we can't see any of that. All right, the question is, this edge is going to be our stitching line, and I want to create a seam allowance. Now, what I do on my patterns is usually I end up taking in fabric on the princess seams in that waist area above the waist. Now, if you feel that you are a larger woman who has curves, what you might want to do is make your seam allowance 1 inch to give you a little bit more room to really tweak this back. For example, if you know, like when you try and ready to wear garments, that you always have a tight bum, then you're probably going to be letting out a seam allowance in this area right here. If you have a very broad back, you might find it's a little tight in ready to wear clothes, so you might want to let out your seam allowances here. But then again, you might have a tiny waist and you bring it in at the waist to give that beautiful hourglass effect. So what I'm going to do is just take some extra strips and tape it to this edge, tape it to that edge, and then when I'm finished, I'll join you back here at the video. Here I added on all the extra pieces of paper, and you can tell it's not perfect, but I just wanted to extend it out so I can create a seam allowance. And now what I'm going to do is create my 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I will take this edge that was cut, and I'm just going to mark it at the 1/2 inch marking, and then all the way up I'm going to mark a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'll just go right up this back piece, and you're just looking for that edge, and that's actually right on the edge right there. Okay, and then I'll just extend this right over here. There we go. All right, so now all I'm going to do is cut off the excess. So I'm going to cut this straight across on the bottom, and then cut my seam allowance, and I'll go all the way up, go into that curve. This is really quick and easy to do with a rotary cutter and a mat. With the scissors, it'll just take a little bit more time. That's no problem. And you can see right here, I didn't cut that all off. So let me get a little bit better right there. All right. And then last but not least, I'm going to take my marker and write in 1/2 inch seam allowance. So if you have a bigger seam allowance, you definitely want to write in what that seam allowance is, because let me tell you, you will forget. So if it's 3/4, you write in 3/4. If it's 1 inch, you write in 1 inch. You don't want to make that mistake of stitching a deeper or a lesser seam allowance. All right, so there we go. And now I'm just going to cut out around the markings here, and then I will show you when I am finished with both of my pattern pieces. Here's my second piece, and you can see right here I added the extra paper to create a 1/2 inch seam allowance. This right here is the line that we cut it apart on, and this is going to become our new cutting line with that seam allowance. And so what I'm going to do is the same as this piece. I cut off all the extra. So I'll take my rotary cutter and just go right up and create my new cut line. And I'm not very good doing this from this angle, so I might have to recut that to clean that up so I don't have a whole lot of excess. All right, so let me try to go in a little bit more, and I'll curve it around up here. All right, and then I will cut it off here. Okay, and just take these extras, throw them away. And then right here, I'll cut along here to have my cut line for the bottom. And then we're just going to cut right up the side. Bring it down. And then I'll just angle this for you. Now the armhole we leave at that 1/4 inch. So all of this will get thrown away. Now I realize we haven't cut out the sleeves yet. I like to do the dress first, and then when we get to the sleeves, we'll do measuring for the sleeves. And if we had any adjustments in the shoulder seam, that needs to be reflected on the sleeves. So that's why I kind of hold off for these, as well as the cutting the neck bindings, because you may need to tweak your neck binding if you want, for example, the front a little bit lower or the back a little bit lower, because I can tell you how to recalculate those neck bands. So this video has covered some of the basic alterations, and in video 4 we're going to cover some of the alterations that they show here on your pattern. So it would account for if you have a short torso, a long torso, if you want to adjust the length of your dress, because what if you're petite, what if you're very tall? You can do those, and those are easy changes, as well as think about where your armholes sit. Do dresses cut into your armhole? Is it very uncomfortable? Or maybe they are cut too low. Maybe you have very short armholes and you need to bring that up a bit. So I'll show you how to do that in the next video. That's video number 4. All right, those are not a complete list of alterations that you may need to do. I want you to think about a couple more things. Are you very tall? Do you need more length on this dress? Are you short-waisted or long-waisted? And sometimes this really confuses people. If you've ever tried on a bathing suit, I think this is where a lot of this stuff kind of shows up. If you are really tight in your bathing suit from your shoulders to your crotch, and you just know you don't have enough room, you probably have a long torso. If you are short-waisted, if you're like me, sometimes I feel like, your pants are always coming up way too high. I am short-waisted, so I am narrower in my, or I should say shorter in my torso than the average person. So if you feel that you have these issues, please let me know. I will do a separate video on this to show you how to add the length to a dress, how to accommodate for a long torso or a short torso to help you give the best possible fit. And remember, don't cut out your sleeves yet. Don't cut out your neck bands, because we need to measure for our sleeves and make sure that our armholes are correct before we go and cut those out, because our sleeves may need alterations.